The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in late October. I know the exact time because I'd been sitting in my kitchen, couldn't sleep, drinking the last of a pot of coffee I'd brewed around 9 and forgotten about. The kind of coffee that goes cold and bitter at the bottom of the mug and you drink it anyway because getting up to make a fresh pot would require a decision you're not quite ready to make. The windows were fogged from the inside. The radiator in the hallway was ticking the way it always did in that house, that old, patient tick, tick, tick that I'd lived with for so many years it had become a kind of company. The television was off. I wasn't reading. I was just sitting there in the particular silence that belongs to men who have already buried one person they loved and are not entirely sure what to do with all the hours that remain. My phone lit up on the table. The number on the screen was my daughter's. My daughter Clara. I picked up on the second ring, and what I heard on the other end wasn't her voice exactly. It was the sound of someone who has been crying for a long time and has moved past the point where crying makes any noise. That hollow, airless sound, like breathing through a towel pressed against your face. "Dad," she said. Just that. Just the one word. And I was already standing up. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I want to tell you that I was composed, measured, all those things a man of 61 years ought to be when his daughter calls him at midnight sounding like that. The truth is, the coffee mug was on the floor, and I have no clear memory of setting it there. My heart was doing something that my doctor would have had strong opinions about, but my hands were steady. That part, I can tell you honestly. The hands were steady, the way they'd been trained to be steady in situations that required steadiness. The rest of me was terrified, but the hands were ready. "I'm coming," I told her before she said another word. She tried to tell me I didn't have to. She said it was fine. She said things were okay. She used the word okay 3 separate times in a row, and every repetition made it less believable. I could hear something in the background. A voice. Low. Controlled. The particular flatness of a man who has chosen a tone specifically because he knows it will not be what anyone calls shouting, but carries the same weight. I was in my jacket before she finished the sentence. I want to step back from that night for just a moment, because if I take you straight into what happened next, you'll be missing something important. You'll be missing the months that came before it, the summer, that barbecue, the things that were said in a backyard in front of people who laughed along because they didn't know what else to do. You'll be missing the reason I knew, the moment I heard Clara's voice at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in October, that this was not a small thing. But first, I need to tell you who I am. My name is Raymond Aldrich. I'm 61 years old. I live in a small brick house on Delwood Terrace in Campbellton, Ohio, a town that has a grain elevator, 2 diners, a high school with a leaky gymnasium, and roughly 12,000 people who mostly know each other's names. I was married for 26 years to a woman named Margaret. She passed away 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer, quickly and without the dignity that she deserved, but with more grace than most people are capable of at any stage of their lives. We had one daughter together, Clara. Before I retired, I spent 23 years driving for a private executive transport company out of Columbus after a stint in the Army in my late teens and early 20s that included 18 months overseas doing things I don't talk about in polite company. When I drove executives, I drove them to airports, to board meetings, to hospitals late at night when their children were ill and no one was supposed to know. I learned in both of those careers how to be invisible in a way that made people comfortable, how to be the person in the room that no one is watching. I also learned some other things, physical things, things about how bodies move and where they are strong and where they are not. I'm a quiet man. I always have been. People look at me, gray at the temples now, a little heavier than I was at 30, wearing the same kind of flannel shirts I've worn since the Carter administration. And they see a retired man from a small town who probably watches too much news and talks about the weather too often at the grocery store. That impression has, over the years, served me well. If this story has touched anything in you already, if you've ever sat in a kitchen at midnight waiting for a phone to ring or praying it wouldn't, I want you to stay with me until the very end, because what happened over the months between that summer and that Tuesday night is something I've needed to say out loud for a long time. And if this is the kind of story you want to hear more of, I'd be grateful if you left a like, left a comment, and subscribe to this channel, because there are people telling these stories who need to know someone is listening. Now, let me take you back to where this really began. It began on a Saturday afternoon in June, in my neighbor Phil Garza's backyard, at a cookout that Phil throws every summer because Phil is the kind of man who decides, every May without fail, that this is the year he becomes good at grilling. He never does. But the potato salad his wife Renata makes is legendary, and honestly, that alone is worth showing up for. I had been living on Delwood Terrace alone for 4 years by then, since Margaret died. The house was clean. I've always been a clean person. But it had the specific quality of a space where someone once moved through all the rooms and now doesn't. I'd gotten into a routine. Mornings I made oatmeal, which I don't especially like, because Margaret had always said it was good for the heart, and somewhere in the machinery of grief I kept doing the things she had recommended. I walked the same 3-block loop around the neighborhood every morning at 7. I had coffee with my former colleague Harold Bates on Thursdays at the Sunrise Diner on Route 9. I read. I helped my neighbor Mrs. Poole with her back garden on alternating Saturdays, which she paid me for in baked goods and which was the most effective form of currency I had encountered in any economy. I volunteered on Tuesday evenings at the Campbellton Veterans Center, helping run a social hour for older vets who didn't have much family. That was perhaps the truest part of my week. Those men and women, a lot of them past 70, some past 80, they'd sit there in that overlit room with its folding tables and bad fluorescent bulbs, and they'd talk. Really talk, the way people talk when they're not trying to impress anyone. I liked being there. I liked feeling useful in a way that didn't require me to explain myself. I was, by every external measure, a retired man living a quiet and unremarkable life in a quiet and unremarkable town. What I was also doing, quietly and without particular announcement, was loving my daughter so thoroughly that there was barely room in it for doubt. Clara was 32 that summer. She worked as a pediatric occupational therapist at a clinic in Dayton, 40 minutes from Campbellton, and she was extraordinary at her job. I know every parent says that, but Clara had this specific gift for making frightened children feel safe that was not something you learned in school. You either had it or you didn't, and she had it in abundance. She had Margaret's eyes and Margaret's patience and my stubbornness, which in her manifested not as hardness but as a kind of quiet persistence that I respected more than I can adequately say. She had always been close to me, even through the years when daughters and fathers find the distance between them widening in ways neither quite intends. She called twice a week. She came to Campbellton for the small holidays as well as the large ones. When Margaret was sick, Clara drove that 40-minute highway at 11 o'clock at night, more than once, because she sensed something in my voice on the phone that told her I needed company I wasn't asking for. I owed her, as far as I was concerned, everything. She had started dating Dominic Farrell about 14 months before Phil's barbecue. Dominic was 35, worked in commercial real estate development out of Dayton, drove a dark gray Lexus that he washed himself every Sunday morning, and had the particular confidence of a man who had been told he was impressive for so long that it had stopped occurring to him to verify it. He was tall, with a good handshake and thick dark hair going slightly silver at the sides, which he wore in a way that suggested he was aware it looked distinguished. He smiled readily. He had opinions about wine. He used the word leverage in conversations that did not involve business. The first time Clara brought him to Delwood Terrace for dinner, I made pot roast, which is the thing I can make without anxiety, and Dominic was perfectly pleasant. He complimented the house. He talked about a development project in Dayton with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. He helped clear the table without being asked, which I noticed. He called me sir twice, which I also noticed. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. Clara was happy, or what looked in that first dinner like happiness. And after 4 years of watching her carry the weight of her mother's death alongside her own life, I wanted her to be happy so badly that I was prepared to do considerable interpretive work on her behalf. I kept telling myself, in those first months, that the small things I noticed were nothing. There was the way he sometimes finished her sentences at the dinner table, not warmly, the way couples do who know each other well, but with a small corrective precision, as if the sentence she had started was heading somewhere imprecise and needed to be redirected. There was the way he once, when she reached for the last bread roll, touched her wrist with 2 fingers, barely, nothing you could point to, and she put her hand back in her lap. There was the way he talked about her job with a particular species of compliment that managed to diminish while complimenting. Clara does really meaningful work. It's not the kind of thing I could do, honestly. It requires a lot of patience with, well, with a very specific kind of person. He said this at Easter, in front of my sister Luann and her husband, and Clara smiled and looked at her plate. I told myself, these are small things. Every relationship has friction. I told myself this until Phil Garza's barbecue in June, and then I stopped being able to tell myself anything like that anymore. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind of Ohio June afternoon that delivers exactly what June promises. Sun with just enough breeze to make the shade feel rewarding, the smell of cut grass from someone a few doors down, Renata Garza's potato salad gleaming in a bowl on the picnic table. There were maybe 18 people there, the usual neighborhood assembly, Phil and Renata, the Moody's from the corner house, the Prentice family, Harold Bates from the diner, a couple of younger neighbors I recognized by face but not by name. Clara and Dominic were there. Dominic's mother, Beverly, a sharp-faced woman in her early 60s who wore her displeasure like a brooch, visible and intentional, sat in a lawn chair near the drinks cooler, watching the proceedings with an expression that suggested she had been to better parties in her time and wished to make this known. I was sitting in one of Phil's folding chairs, eating Renata's potato salad and talking to Harold about nothing of any consequence, when it started. Phil was holding court over the grill, narrating his cooking the way he always did, and Dominic had wandered over to offer what he framed as helpful suggestions, but which Phil later told me, with considerable irritation, had been a running commentary on everything Phil was doing wrong. At some point, Dominic drifted away from the grill, drink in hand, and joined the loose circle of people that had formed near the picnic table. The conversation turned, the way conversations at summer barbecues do, to work and stress and the economy. Harold mentioned that he was thinking of selling the diner. One of the younger neighbors, a kid named Brett who did something with logistics, talked about his hours. And then Dominic, with the casual authority of a man who has decided that his version of a topic is the definitive one, began talking about pressure. Real pressure, he called it. The kind you dealt with in commercial real estate. The kind of money at stake. The timelines, the deals that could fall apart in 48 hours. Most people, he said, not looking at anyone in particular, have no concept of what actual high-stakes pressure feels like. They think pressure is a busy afternoon. He said it pleasantly. That was the thing. He said it in a tone that invited agreement, that positioned it as an obvious shared truth rather than a claim that required defense. I didn't say anything. Harold, who knew me well enough to notice when I was being quiet in a pointed way, glanced at me briefly and then looked back at his drink. Then Phil, because Phil is good-hearted and not always quick to read a room, said, "Well, Ray here. You know Ray was in the Army, and then he drove for, what was it, Ray, 20-some years?" And Dominic turned to look at me. I want to be accurate about what happened next, because memory can be a generous editor, and I don't want to edit this. He looked at me. He looked at me the way a person sometimes looks at a piece of furniture, registering it without granting it full membership in the category of things requiring serious attention. And then he smiled, that practiced, even smile, and he said, "With respect, sir, driving people around and following orders is a very different animal from managing 9 figures of real capital under deadline. No offense meant." He paused, then added, as though this were the gracious part, "Besides, at your stage, you've probably earned the right not to think about pressure anymore. Must be nice." There was a beat of silence. Then Beverly laughed, from her lawn chair by the cooler. A short, bright little laugh, like a spoon tapping a crystal glass. And 2 of the younger neighbors laughed too, because they'd heard it as a joke and didn't want to be the ones not laughing. And Dominic raised his drink slightly, as if to toast the moment. Clara did not laugh. I looked at her. She was looking at the picnic table, at a point somewhere near the edge of it, and her jaw was set in a way that I recognized from when she was 8 years old, and trying not to cry in front of other people because she thought it would embarrass me. It never had, but she'd always believed it might. I held Dominic's gaze for a moment. I held it long enough that it became, in the way that held silences do, a kind of statement in its own right. Then I said very quietly, "No offense taken." And I went back to my potato salad. That was all. Dominic looked, for just a fraction of a second, like a man who had thrown a punch and not gotten the reaction a punch is supposed to get. It passed quickly. He moved on. The conversation moved on. But that night, after the barbecue, after Clara had hugged me goodbye in Phil's driveway and Dominic had given me the abbreviated handshake of a man who has already decided a relationship is not worth investing in, that night, I sat in my kitchen on Delwood Terrace, and I thought about the way my daughter's jaw had been set, and I thought about the two-fingered wrist touch at Easter, and I thought about the number of times in the past 14 months that I had talked myself out of what I was seeing. Fear, when you're older, isn't loud. It's quiet, cold, efficient. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in like weather. I was afraid for my daughter. The months after that barbecue were a particular kind of difficult. The kind where nothing catastrophic is happening, and yet everything feels slightly wrong, like a note that's nearly in tune but not quite, and you keep waiting for someone to fix it or for the dissonance to resolve itself. I watched from my 40-minute distance. I called Clara twice a week, as I always had. She was cheerful on the phone in the specific way that people are cheerful when they are concentrating on sounding it. She talked about her cases at the clinic. A 6-year-old boy who had made huge strides with his motor coordination. A little girl who had laughed for the first time in a session. And I could hear, underneath the genuine tenderness she brought to those stories, something tired, something compressed. Thanksgiving that year was held at Dominic's suggestion at his and Clara's shared apartment in Dayton, which was large and modern, and had the quality of a space that had been professionally furnished rather than lived in. Beverly was there, in the same posture she'd occupied at the barbecue, watchful, slightly superior, content only when correcting someone. I made the cranberry sauce because Clara had asked me to bring something, and cranberry sauce was something I could make without incident, and Beverly tasted it and said with complete pleasantness, "It's a bit sweet for my taste, but then again I prefer things prepared traditionally." She said it to the room in general, and not to me specifically, which made it harder to respond to. Dominic, over the course of that Thanksgiving, did 4 separate things that I noted mentally with the careful, unhurried attention I had once been trained to bring to environments that required it. He interrupted Clara twice while she was telling a story about a patient. Not aggressively, but with a kind of casual ownership of the conversation that implied her stories were the opening act for his. He told me when I offered to help wash up after dinner that he had a system and preferred to do it himself, which might have been innocuous except that the glance he directed at Clara immediately afterward clearly meant that she should stay put as well. He spent 11 minutes on the phone in the kitchen during dinner, and when Clara mentioned gently that it was Thanksgiving, he said, "I know what day it is, Clara," in a tone so flat and particular that everyone at the table became very interested in their plates. The 4th thing was the thing that stayed with me. After dinner, I was in the hallway putting on my coat, and Clara was helping me, and she said something. I can't remember what exactly. Something small. Something about how she was glad I'd come. And as she was saying it, I saw her glance over her shoulder toward the kitchen. Just a glance, but a glance with a particular quality. The quality of a person checking where something is. The way you check where an unpredictable thing is in a room because knowing its location is a form of safety. I didn't say anything right then. I buttoned my coat. But in the car, driving back to Campbellton on the dark November highway, I thought about that glance for 40 consecutive minutes. I thought about it the way you think about a sound in the walls of an old house. Not sure yet if it's settling or if it's something else entirely. Christmas came. Christmas was held at my house on Delwood Terrace at Clara's request. She asked in a voice that had a specific undertone of please, like she needed the geography of my house around her more than she needed the holiday. And Dominic arrived an hour late, explaining with easy authority that he'd had a call he had to take, and no further explanation was offered or apparently expected. Beverly came along naturally. I had cooked a full turkey, roasted potatoes, green beans with almonds because it was the one thing Margaret used to make that I had finally, after 4 years of failed attempts, learned to make properly. After dinner, after Beverly had retired to the guest room for what she called her constitutional rest, and Dominic was in the living room on his phone, I was in the kitchen washing dishes, and Clara came in to help. We stood side by side at the sink, the way we used to when she was a girl and she'd dry while I washed, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm sorry about the barbecue." "What he said?" I handed her a wet dish. "You don't need to apologize for someone else." "He didn't mean it badly," she said. She said it the way people say things they've practiced saying, smooth, a little fast. I rinsed another dish, handed it to her. "Clara," I said. "I know," she said quietly. "Do you?" She was quiet again. She dried the dish very carefully, more carefully than it required. And then she turned slightly, just slightly toward me, and the kitchen light caught her upper arm in a way that made me see what I had been half afraid to see for months, high on the arm, near the shoulder, a mark that could have been a lot of things. Could have been. I kept my voice exactly where it was. I kept my hands in the dishwater. "How long?" I asked. "It's not," she started. "Clara." She set the dish down on the counter. She looked at the window over the sink, at the dark glass with the winter garden behind it, invisible in the December night. "It gets better," she said, "and then something stresses him out and it's complicated, Dad. His mother and the pressure at work, and he doesn't. He's not a bad person." She believed this, I think, or she needed to believe it in a way that amounted to the same thing. I turned the tap off. I dried my own hands on the dish towel, slowly, and I said, very quietly, because Dominic was 20 feet away on the other side of a wall, "I need you to remember something. The word we always had. You remember the word?" She looked at me then. Her eyes were bright in the kitchen light. When Clara was 14, I'd taught her something. I'd taught it to her not because I anticipated something like this. God, I never anticipated something like this. But because I had spent too many years in too many environments where I had seen what could happen to people who had no way to call for help that didn't announce itself as calling for help. We had a word, one word, a word that could be dropped into a conversation, into a text message, into a phone call, that sounded like nothing and meant everything. It meant, "I am not safe, and I need you." The word was copper. "I remember," she said. "That's all I'm going to say," I told her. "I'm not going to say anything else tonight, but I need you to know that word still works. It will always work. No questions asked. You say it and I come." She nodded once, very small. I turned the tap back on. We washed the rest of the dishes in silence, and Dominic came into the kitchen eventually to get a glass of water, and nothing else was said about any of it that night. January and February passed slowly, the way Ohio winter months do, gray and long and cold in a way that is not dramatic but simply relentless. I called Clara twice a week. She called me back. She sounded tired in ways she attributed to a busy caseload, a difficult period at the clinic, the general weight of winter. I listened to the surface of what she said and tried to hear what was underneath it without letting on that I was listening that hard. I went back to the Veterans Center on Tuesday evenings. I walked my morning loop. I had coffee with Harold. I helped Mrs. Poole plan her spring garden, working from seed catalogs at her kitchen table while her cat walked across the pages. And I waited. I want you to understand something about waiting. Not the impatient kind of waiting, the kind where you check the clock, the kind where you have resolved that something will happen and you don't know when, but you will be ready for it when it does. That is a different kind of waiting entirely. It requires a particular relationship with stillness. I had cultivated that relationship over a long time, and I was grateful for it that winter because there were nights when I came very close to driving to Dayton without any particular plan, and the stillness was the only thing that told me that arriving unprepared would not help her. So I waited, and I was ready, and I kept the gas tank of my truck above 3/4 full at all times between December and October. Small detail. But I want you to know how seriously I took the waiting. The text came at 11:43 on a Tuesday night in late October. I was in the kitchen. I was drinking bad coffee. The radiator was ticking. The text was from Clara's number. It said, in its entirety, "The copper kitchen mixer you gave us is still my favorite thing in the apartment." We didn't own a copper kitchen mixer. I had never given her one. There was no such object. There was only the word. I was in my truck by 11:46. I want to tell you what it felt like to drive that highway at 11-something on a Tuesday night knowing what I knew. I can tell you it was raining. A steady, cold October rain, the kind that gets in under windshield wipers. I can tell you the highway was mostly empty, just the occasional set of oncoming headlights sweeping through the dark and the rain. I can tell you my truck, a 2017 Ford F-150 that I'd bought secondhand and kept in good condition because keeping things in good condition is one of the habits that outlasts everything, was running well. The heater worked. The radio was off. What I felt was not panic. I want to be precise about this because it might seem unbelievable and I need you to believe it. I was afraid. I was profoundly afraid. But fear, in my experience and in the experience of everyone I know who has ever functioned under genuine threat, is not incompatible with calm. It simply requires that you've been somewhere frightening before and found your way through it. That you have some rough interior proof that the fear is survivable. I called the Dayton non-emergency police line at 11:52 and asked, calmly and specifically, for a wellness check at Clara's address on Meridian Park Drive. I gave them my name. I gave them the address. I told them I had received a prearranged distress signal from my daughter. The dispatcher, a woman who had the careful professional neutrality of someone who has heard most things, confirmed the address and told me a unit would be dispatched. I thanked her. I kept driving. I also called Clara back. It went to voicemail after 4 rings. I called again. Voicemail again. I left no message. I was 9 minutes from the apartment when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Dayton area code. I picked up. Mr. Aldrich? A male voice, formal. Yes. This is Officer Paulson with Dayton PD. We're at the Meridian Park address. Sir, your daughter is safe, but I think you should come. I drove. I will not describe in detail what I found when I arrived at that apartment building on Meridian Park Drive, because some details belong to Clara and not to this story, and I will not take from her the privacy of the worst night of her life. What I will tell you is that when I walked through that door and saw my daughter sitting on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself, a female officer beside her, and a red mark on her cheek that had not been there at Christmas, I had one of those crystalline moments of absolute clarity that tend, in my experience, to visit people when a decision has already been made by a part of the brain that outpaces the conscious mind. Dominic was in the kitchen. He was standing against the counter with 2 officers near him, talking. He was doing the version of talking that men in his situation sometimes do. Not belligerent, not visibly panicked, but very smooth, very reasonable, choosing words with the care of someone who is aware that words are now the primary tool available to him. He looked at me when I came in. His expression cycled through several things quickly. Surprise, recalculation, something that might have been the first stirring of real unease. He hadn't, I think, expected me to be there. He had not, until that moment, taken seriously the idea that I might simply come. I walked past him. I sat down next to Clara. I put my arm around her. She leaned into me and she said, very quietly against my shoulder, "I'm sorry, Dad." "You have nothing to be sorry for," I said. "I should have said the word sooner." "You said it when you were ready," I said. "That's all that matters." Officer Paulson came over and asked me several questions, quietly and professionally, and I answered them clearly and without embellishment. When I mentioned, in the matter-of-fact way you mentioned something that is simply part of your history, my Army service and the nature of what I'd done in those years, not bragging, just providing context for a question he'd asked, he paused, looked at me with a kind of recalibration, and said, "Okay, sir. Okay." The other officers in the room had a similar moment of recalibration over the next few minutes. It happens sometimes. People revise their understanding of you, and you can see it happening in their expressions, like a photograph developing. Dominic was watching this from the kitchen. His smooth, reasonable tone had gone slightly quieter. He was watching me the way people watch something that doesn't fit the category they had put it in, and finding the mismatch uncomfortable. I did not speak to him, not then. There will be people who read this or hear this and wonder why not, why I didn't say something, why I didn't do something beyond sitting on that couch with my arm around my daughter while the officers handled the practical machinery of what happened next. I will tell you why. Because in that apartment, on that night, with those officers present, the most protective thing I could be for Clara was calm and steady and present. Not angry, not loud. Not the thing that anyone would later be able to point to and say, "Look, her father was also volatile." There are ways of being dangerous that make the people you love more vulnerable. I had learned this. I held my daughter and I was quiet and I was completely, entirely there. Dominic left the apartment that night with the officers. He was not at that stage formally arrested. The specifics of what came next took time and paperwork in a system that does not move as fast as a father's truck on a rainy highway. He left. The apartment became still. Beverly had called 3 times while all of this was unfolding. Clara didn't answer. I did not suggest she should. At about 2 in the morning, after the officers had finished what they needed to finish and had given Clara a card with numbers and information and said with genuine kindness that she had done the right thing and should call if she needed anything. After all of that, Clara and I sat together on that couch in the quiet apartment, and Clara said, "I don't know what I want to do." "You don't have to know tonight," I said. "The clinic will be there, Monday. My things are all right where they are for now." She was quiet for a moment. "Will you stay?" she asked, not like a child asking, like a person who has had something taken from them and has only just begun to understand that they are allowed to ask for what they need. "I already called Harold and asked him to feed my neighbor's cat tomorrow," I said. I hadn't. I would in the morning. But she needed to hear it right then. She made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else entirely. She leaned her head on my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small and we'd watch television together on the couch in the house on Delwood Terrace while Margaret made tea in the kitchen. And we sat like that for a long time, not talking, the rain still going outside, the city doing what cities do at 2 in the morning. Now here is the part of the story I haven't told yet, the part that I suspect some of you might find harder to believe than any of the rest of it, and that I am going to ask you to believe anyway, because it happened exactly as I'm about to tell it. It was the Thursday morning after that Tuesday night. Clara was staying with me in Campbellton. She'd taken a few days off work, and we had settled into a quiet rhythm in the house on Delwood Terrace, cooking meals, walking the morning loop together, not talking about everything but talking about some things slowly, at a pace that felt right. I was recovering my own equilibrium. The first 48 hours after something like that Tuesday night carry a particular exhausted stillness, like the air after a storm has passed and the trees are all still and dripping and you're not quite sure yet what damage you're assessing. I had driven out that Thursday morning to pick up a few things from the grocery store on Route 9. It was cool, about 42 degrees, the sky the flat pewter gray of an Ohio October morning that has decided not to commit to anything. I was on my way back, on Ralston Road, which passes over the Norfolk Southern Rail crossing at the south end of town, one of those crossings with the drop-arm barriers and the lights, the old kind that flashes red when a train is coming. The barriers were down. The lights were flashing. A westbound freight train was maybe a quarter-mile out, coming at standard freight speed on a flat track. I could hear it, that low building vibration that you feel in your chest before you fully hear it with your ears. And sitting on the tracks, stranded dead center between the rails with its wheels stuck in the gap where the pavement had cracked and subsided into the railbed over years of use, was a dark gray Lexus. I knew the car immediately. Beverly was inside, alone in the passenger seat. Dominic had apparently been driving, gotten out to assess the situation, and in what I can only interpret as a moment of profound and revealing panic, had stepped away from the vehicle and was standing 10 feet back from the track, phone to his ear, saying something I couldn't hear at that distance. Beverly was not getting out. I do not know if she was frozen with fear or if she genuinely couldn't figure out how to open the door. She was 70 feet from me, inside a car on a railroad track, and there was a freight train a quarter-mile away moving fast. I want to tell you, I thought about it. I did not think about it. I parked my truck at the road's edge, left it running, and I covered that distance the way the body knows how to cover distance when it has been trained to do so, and has not entirely forgotten. The car door was locked. I hit the window with the flat of my fist, not a knocking tap, but a solid, direct impact that gets attention. Beverly turned to look at me through the glass with an expression I recognized, pure, uncomplicated terror. "Unlock the door," I said at once clearly, loud enough to carry over the train sound, which was now very present, a weight in the air. She unlocked it. I had her out of that car in approximately 8 seconds. I know this because I have gone over it many times since, and 8 seconds is accurate. I kept one hand on her arm and moved her with me away from the track, toward the roadside, in a path that was direct and not negotiable. She stumbled once. I steadied her without breaking stride. We cleared the track with the car still on it. The freight train hit the Lexus at 11:24 that Thursday morning. The sound is not what you expect from movies. Movies give you explosion, spectacle. What a freight train does to a stopped car is more mechanical than that. A massive, industrial disassembly at speed. It was loud. It was over in a few seconds. The train didn't stop. Freight trains of that size don't stop quickly. The Campbellton crossing was half a mile behind it before the last of the car's pieces finished settling. Beverly was sitting on the gravel at the roadside. She was shaking badly. I was crouched in front of her, checking her over. She was physically unhurt, just the shaking and the shock. Dominic had come forward by then. He was standing a few feet away, phone still in his hand, staring at the track where the car had been. He looked at me. I don't know exactly how long he'd been aware of who I was. The father of the woman in the apartment on Tuesday night, the man from Phil Garza's barbecue, the retired driver who was too old to understand real pressure. However long it had been, in this moment, it seemed to be rearranging itself for him in some significant way. He said, in a voice I had never heard from him before, not the smooth real estate voice, not the dismissive barbecue voice, not the controlled voice from the apartment, he said, his own hands shaking now. "Who taught you to move like that?" I looked at him. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "People you don't know." And I went back to checking that Beverly was all right. The police arrived within 4 minutes. The railroad company's emergency response team was there within 15. Beverly was taken to Campbellton General as a precaution. She was released that same afternoon, shaken but unharmed. I gave my account to 2 officers, one of whom, when I mentioned my military background and the years with the Executive Transport Company, nodded slowly and said, "That explains a lot, sir." It was said with respect, genuine respect, and I received it without comment. Dominic spoke to the officers as well. He was by then very quiet. All the smooth efficiency of him had gone somewhere, and what was underneath it was younger and less certain, and I will say this, because I believe in being accurate even when it's complicated, it was frightened. There was a real person underneath all that performance, and the real person was frightened. And part of me, even then, found it difficult not to feel something complicated about that. I called Clara from the parking lot of Campbellton General while Beverly was still being evaluated inside. "Something happened this morning?" I said. "Dad," she said immediately. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Your future in-law's fine. Her son's car is not fine." There was a pause. "Tell me," she said. I told her. She was quiet for a long time after. Then she said, in a voice that had something in it I hadn't heard from her in months, something that sounded like her own voice, not the careful, managed version of it. She said, "He called you too old to understand pressure." "He did," I said. Another pause. Then, "He's an idiot," she said. And there was something in the way she said it, definitive, clear, without any of the usual hedging or qualification, that sounded like the beginning of something. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing that follows something like that is simple, and I will not pretend otherwise, because you deserve to hear the real version of what rebuilding looks like, not the one where everything resolves itself cleanly into a lesson and a bow. Clara retained a lawyer in Dayton, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who came recommended by the domestic violence advocacy organization that one of the police officers from Tuesday night had quietly given Clara the number for. Patricia was precise and unsentimental in a way that I found deeply reassuring, because what Clara needed was not sympathy at that point. She had plenty of people offering sympathy. She needed someone who was going to navigate the system effectively on her behalf without flinching. Dominic was charged with domestic battery. The charge stuck. There was a restraining order. The engagement, which had been official since April, a ring I had never been asked my opinion about and had said nothing about because it was Clara's life and Clara's choice, was over. Clara filed the paperwork herself, which was important, I think, because it meant that she did it, she was the one who did it, nobody did it for her. That is not a small thing. I drove to Dayton 3 times in November to help her collect her things from the apartment and move them to a storage unit on the east side of Dayton near the clinic. The moves were quiet and efficient. Dominic was not there. The restraining order saw to that. And in his absence, the apartment felt like something the air had finally been let back into. The day we appeared in court. Clara to give a statement. Me in the gallery alongside Patricia's paralegal, and a friend of Clara's from the clinic named Jessie, who had driven 40 minutes on a workday because she was the kind of friend that 40-minute drives were made for. That day had a kind of formal, procedural weight that was both less dramatic and more significant than anything I had expected. Courts, the interior of them, have always struck me as places designed to make the human drama they contain feel very small relative to the architecture and the paperwork. Perhaps that is their job. Clara spoke clearly and without visible trembling, though I know, because I know my daughter, that the steadiness cost her. She spoke for 7 minutes. She described what had happened across 14 months in a language that was specific and accurate and contained not a single ounce of drama for its own sake. It was the most quietly brave thing I have ever watched another person do. When they asked me to speak, as a witness, a corroborating presence, I said very little. I said what I knew, what I had seen with my own eyes, and I said it plainly. I said one thing near the end that I had not planned to say, that came out because it was the nearest true thing I could reach. I don't want him punished for my sake. I want him to understand what he did so that he does not do it to anyone else. I want accountability, not revenge. There's a difference. There always is. The judge, a woman somewhere in her 50s with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, looked at me when I said that. She didn't say anything, but she looked at me in a way that told me the statement had reached her. Dominic across the room looked at the table in front of him. The outcome was formal probation, mandatory counseling, the domestic battery charge on his record. It was not, I suppose, what some people think of as justice. There are those who would say it was too lenient, and I understand that position, and I will not argue against it. What I will say is that Clara left that courtroom alongside me and Patricia and Jesse, and she walked out into the November afternoon with her chin at an angle that I recognized, her mother's angle, the one that means the thing that needed doing has been done, and we are moving forward now. I put my arm around her briefly, just briefly, and she squeezed my hand once, and we walked to the parking lot. We stopped at a diner on the way back. Nothing significant. A diner off the highway, with laminated menus and decent pie and a server who called everyone Hon, without irony. We ordered coffee and peach pie and sat in a window booth watching the November highway outside. And for the first time in longer than I could easily calculate, I felt the particular quality of relief that arrives not when a crisis is resolved, but when you finally believe it will not return. "You okay?" I asked her. "I think so," she said. "Actually, yes, I think so." We ate the pie. It was good pie. The coffee was average, but hot. Winter moved in thoroughly, the way it does in Ohio. Settled, gray, long, with the occasional snow that covered the streets of Campbellton and made Delwood Terrace look cleaner than it was. Clara found an apartment in Dayton, a one-bedroom on Harlow Street, on the 3rd floor of a building with a working elevator and a landlord named Mr. Vitale, who was 80 years old, moved very slowly, and kept the common areas impeccably maintained. She paid the first month's rent herself from money she had been quietly setting aside. She told me this the day she moved in, and I felt something move in my chest when she said it. She had been planning, even in the middle of all of it. She had been planning. I helped her move in on a Saturday in early December. We carried boxes up the stairs. She'd refused to wait for the elevator, said she wanted the exercise, and by noon the apartment was arranged in a way that was distinctly, recognizably hers. Plants on the windowsill, a quilt her mother had made folded over the back of the couch, books in stacks that would eventually become shelves, the copper kitchen mixer that didn't exist as a real object but existed now, in the language between us, as a kind of emblem of something. She had a photograph of a copper kitchen mixer on her phone that she had set as her lock screen, and she showed it to me and laughed, really laughed, and I laughed too. And I cannot tell you the last time a laugh had felt that simple and that right. I drove back to Campbellton that evening in the early winter dark, and I sat in my kitchen on Delwood Terrace, and the radiator was ticking its patient tick, and I made myself a reasonable pot of coffee that I actually drank while it was still warm, and I thought, this is what comes after. Not perfection, not erasure, but this, the daily, unspectacular fact of moving forward. I want to tell you about the changes in me, because this story is not only Clara's. I had spent 4 years, since Margaret, living in a kind of managed quiet that I had confused, mostly successfully, with peace. I had my routines, I had the Veterans Center, I had Mrs. Poole's garden and Harold's diner and my morning walk. These were good things, and I do not dismiss them. But there is a difference between maintaining a life and actually inhabiting one, and somewhere in the months of what I've described to you here, I had crossed a line between those two things without quite noticing when. I started going to the Veterans Center, not just on Tuesdays, but on Fridays as well. I started a small workshop there. Nothing formal, just a group of us. some veterans and some not, doing basic woodworking projects. I made a small cabinet. I made a birdhouse that the center put up in the garden and that has been occupied every spring since by a pair of Carolina wrens who have clearly decided it belongs to them and are not interested in my opinion on the matter. My friend Harold, at the diner one Thursday in February, put down his coffee cup and looked at me and said, "You seem lighter. Something's different." "Things are better," I said. "With Clara?" "With everything." He nodded, the way Harold nods when he understands more than he's going to ask about. We drank our coffee. The diner smelled like eggs and toast and coffee, the same way it has smelled every Thursday morning I have walked through its door for 20 years, which is itself a form of peace I had not properly appreciated until I was aware of how much I needed it. In March, Clara's daughter, my granddaughter, Rosie, who is 5 and belongs to a category of human being I was not fully prepared for emotionally and am still adjusting to. Rosie came to spend a weekend at the house on Delwood Terrace, while Clara went to a professional development training in Columbus. Rosie has her grandmother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness and what appears to be her own entirely original personality, which involves strong opinions about which socks are acceptable and an encyclopedic knowledge of a cartoon about a small dog that I have now watched more episodes of than I ever anticipated. On Saturday afternoon, she and I were in the kitchen making grilled cheese sandwiches, her request, very specifically, with no crusts. And she was sitting on the counter watching me butter the bread, which is where she likes to sit because it makes her tall, and she said, very directly in the way that 5-year-olds are direct, "Grandpa, did Mommy's ex-boyfriend hurt her?" I kept my voice exactly where it was. I turned the heat on under the pan. "Yes," I said. "He did." She thought about this. "Is she better now?" "She's getting better every day," I said. Another pause. "Did you help?" "I tried to," I said. She considered this with the full, serious deliberation that 5-year-olds bring to questions they have decided are important. Then she said, in a tone of complete finality, "Good, you're a good grandpa." She picked up a crayon from the counter beside her, she'd been drawing before the sandwich project began, and went back to her drawing, entirely satisfied. I put the sandwiches in the pan. I stood there for a moment. There are times in a life when the universe hands you something simple and exact and true, and the right response is to receive it quietly and not pick it apart. I received it quietly. Then, about 6 weeks later, a letter arrived at the house on Delwood Terrace. Return address. A care facility in Dayton, the kind that provides structured programs for people who are court-mandated to complete counseling. I looked at the name on the return address for a long moment before I opened it. It was from Dominic. It was a page and a half, handwritten. Not elegant. Dominic's handwriting, I discovered, was cramped and uneven, which seemed true in some way I didn't have words for. He wrote about the program he was in. He wrote that he had started, slowly and with considerable resistance, to understand some things about what he had done and why. He wrote that he did not expect forgiveness and was not asking for it. He wrote that he was genuinely sorry, in a way that felt, and I read it 3 times before I trusted my reading, unperformed. Like the voice he'd used on Ralston Road when the car was on the tracks and his hands were shaking. He also wrote, this was near the end of the letter, that he thought about that morning at the railroad crossing often, that it had changed something in his understanding of me and of what he had assumed about people, and that he was still working out what it meant. I sat with the letter for a long time. I called Clara. I read it to her over the phone, slowly, all the way through. She was quiet when I finished. Then she said, "Do you believe him?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I believe he wrote it sincerely. Whether that's the same as being changed? Only time tells that." She was quiet again. "Are you going to write back?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "Are you?" A long pause. "No," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I don't know." "That's an honest answer," I said. "I learned it from somebody," she said. We sat on the phone together for a few more minutes, not talking much, just the sound of each other's breathing and the ordinary background noise of 2 separate lives going on in 2 separate towns, 40 minutes apart, which is close enough. That is the honest version of forgiveness in this story. It is not clean. It is not resolved. It does not arrive with a neat ribbon on it. There was a letter, and there was a conversation, and there was a question that neither of us answered, because some questions are not for answering right away. Some questions are for carrying and examining over time and seeing what they become. That is the kind of forgiveness, or the near approach to it, that I can tell you about honestly, and I will not manufacture a tidier version just because tidier would be easier to carry out of this story. Some things you sit with. That is all right. It is spring now as I record this. Mid-April. My neighbor Mrs. Poole and I have put the first seeds in her back garden. Sweet peas along the fence and some climbing beans, and the same impatient tulips that come up every year regardless of what we do, which I find reassuring. The Carolina wrens are back in the birdhouse I made. Phil Garza has already told 3 people that he has finally figured out the secret to a perfect grill, which means the summer cookout is going to be very interesting. Clara comes to Campbellton most Sundays. She drives the 40 minutes in a small blue Subaru she bought in January, secondhand, from a man in Yellow Springs who had maintained it impeccably. And she pulls up to Delwood Terrace, and she comes inside and we have lunch. And sometimes we watch something on television, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we don't do much of anything in particular. Just exist in the same space on a Sunday afternoon the way that people who love each other get to do when things are all right. Rosie comes along about once a month. The cartoon about the dog remains a fixture of those afternoons. I have opinions about it now. I keep them to myself. There is something I want to say to you directly before I close. I have thought a lot about what this story is about. Not the events of it. Those are what they are, specific and concrete and finished in the way that the past is finished, even when its weight continues into the present. I mean what it is about underneath the events, what it is actually saying. I think it is about the danger of invisible things, the people we overlook because they are quiet, the harm we don't name because naming it would require us to admit it's real, the signals that are there all along, waiting for someone to take them seriously. I was not the hero of this story. I want to be clear about that. Clara was the hero of this story. She was the one who remembered a word. She was the one who sent a text at 11:43 on a Tuesday night in October when the situation had finally become one she was willing to ask for help with. She was the one who stood in a courtroom and spoke for 7 minutes with a steadiness that cost her. She was the one who signed the paperwork, found the apartment, set up the bookshelf, put the quilt on the back of the couch. She did all of that. I just answered the phone. But I want to say something about answering the phone, because I think it matters. Strength isn't winning fights. Strength isn't impressing anyone at a barbecue or managing 9 figures of capital under deadline or any of the performances of power that we sometimes mistake, especially when we are young and certain for the real thing. Strength is being available. Strength is keeping the gas tank above 3/4, just in case. Strength is teaching your daughter a word and meaning it when you say she can use it any time, no questions asked. Strength is answering the phone when someone is afraid, without making them explain themselves before you help them. The man who laughed at me at Phil's barbecue did not know anything about me that mattered. He knew what I looked like from the outside, gray at the temples, flannel shirt, potato salad, small town. He made a calculation about what that meant, about what kind of pressure I could understand, about what I was capable of and what I wasn't. Quiet people are not weak people. Overlooked people are not harmless people. And the most dangerous assumption you can make about the person standing in front of you is that you already know everything you need to know about them based on what's visible. I think about the moment on Ralston Road sometimes. I think about Dominic standing 10 feet back from the tracks with his phone in his hand, and Beverly in the passenger seat, and the freight train coming, and myself, a 61-year-old retired driver from Campbellton, Ohio, in a flannel shirt, covering that distance. I didn't do it to prove something, but I want to be honest about my motives, because it would be easy and satisfying to claim that the moment had a meaning beyond itself, that I was settling something or demonstrating something or answering the barbecue with an action instead of an argument. But that's not what happened in those seconds. In those seconds there was a woman on the tracks and a train coming, and I knew how to move, so I moved. That's the whole of it. The rest is interpretation. But I will say this. When Dominic asked me, shaking, who had taught me to move like that, that was the first moment I had seen him without the performance, without the smooth voice and the raised drink and the dismissive ease. And the person I saw without all of that was someone I couldn't hate, someone who had done real harm and whose harm had real consequences and who needed to face those consequences fully. But someone who was, in the end, not a villain. Just a person who had learned the wrong things about what it meant to be strong and had never been required, until then, to unlearn them. I hope the unlearning is real. I genuinely do. Not for my sake, not even for Clara's, for his sake, and for the sake of whoever else he will encounter in his life. That, as far as I can reach, is the closest thing I have to forgiveness right now. It is not nothing. If you are still listening, and I hope you are, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had someone in your life who was struggling in a way they weren't ready to name yet? Have you ever watched someone you loved make themselves smaller, by degrees, in the presence of another person? Have you ever known something was wrong and not been sure what to do with that knowledge? You don't have to have the answers. You don't have to arrive like a retired army driver at 11:40-something on a rainy highway with all your training intact. You just have to stay close enough to hear. You just have to keep the line open. You just have to answer the phone. That's all I have to say about any of it. That's the story, as honestly as I can tell it, from a man sitting in a small brick house on Delwood Terrace in Campbellton, Ohio, with a cup of coffee that he actually drank while it was still hot this time. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or something you've carried, or a time when you wished somebody had answered the phone, I'd be genuinely grateful if you left a comment below and told me about it. These stories mean something when they're heard, and this channel is a place where they can be heard. Leave a like if it stayed with you. Subscribe if you want to hear more. There are more stories where this one came from, told by a man with no shortage of Tuesday nights to reflect on. I read every comment. I take all of them seriously. And if you take nothing else from this, if the grilled cheese and the Carolina Wrens and the copper kitchen mixer that doesn't exist have all run together by the time you close your browser, take this. The quietest person in the room is rarely the person you think they are. And the bravest thing you may ever do is the thing that nobody sees coming, least of all you. That is enough for today. That is more than enough.